Knights of Guinevere has officially dropped. Glitch Productions' first 2D animated series has hit the internet, and let's just say people are enjoying it immensely. And why wouldn't they? It has great storytelling, great characters, great voice acting, and the animation is amazing. But that's not all, because the pilot episode has completely ignited the theorist in every single one of us. There was a lot of information that was thrown on us in the pilot episode, and honestly, you probably missed a lot of it because there was just so much world building going around every single second. From amazing parallels to one-off sentences to blink and you'll miss it moments. There is a lot to go over, and go over it we shall. So here's everything that you missed in the Knights of Guinevere pilot. The pilot starts off by introducing us to this character whose name is Olivia. We get an opening monologue on how a princess is stuck in a tower and she is surrounded by machines powered by blood. And this is very important because this blood is going to make a resurgence multiple times in the episode. For now, all you need to know is that yes, this is some sort of organic blood, and yes, that would technically mean that these machines are organic as well. And I want you to remember this because this portion is going to be one of the most important things that we learn throughout the series. There is something weirdly organic and human about these machines, to the point that these machines may not be machines at all. And throughout the episode, we get glimpses that these machines are not all robotic, and we are going to see some weird things start happening with them, so keep it in mind. But obviously, the most important thing about this introductory scene is the monologue that we hear at the very beginning, because this is going to set up the characters of Gwennavir and Olivia. I think it's obvious that these two characters are supposed to parallel each other, both of them being trapped in an environment that they don't want to be in, and both of them in desperate need of being rescued. And I think the intro scene does a really good job at kind of subverting our expectations. Originally, we think that this is supposed to be referring to Olivia until it switches to Gwennavir's point of view, in which we think that this is about Gwennavir. In reality, it's about both, and the connection between Gwennavir and Olivia will be important for this entire series. In Olivia's room, there is a portrait, and later in the episode, we're able to see very clearly that this is a family portrait, where of course the mother's face is completely scratched out, which makes sense because the mother is supposed to be Gwennavir. I think we can assume that something terrible had happened to Olivia's mother, and we even get reference to this with Orville Park when he is talking to Olivia, saying that hopefully this makes up for everything. What is he trying to make up for? The death of her mother, and I would assume that it was absolutely tragic and completely scarred Olivia. The fact that Olivia wasn't able to save her mom is probably one of the reasons why she is constantly trying to fix Gwennavir. But in that same breath, I would also assume it is one of the reasons why she is so forceful and weird with Gwennavir. Whatever happened to her mother scarred her for life. When Orville Park, her father, ends up giving her the park, showing her that this is what she's going to inherit, we see the light from her eyes literally vanish. This scene is very intentional. We are watching the childlike innocence, the wonder leave her body. And because that's gone, all that's left is this shell that is desperately trying to hold on to memories and the thoughts of her mother. Continuing on with this opening sequence, we get an incredibly gory scene in which Olivia takes Gwennavir's guts and pulls them out of her body, in which Gwennavir has a visceral reaction. Gwennavir feels pain, but why does Gwennavir feel pain? Why would you program an android to feel something? Well, maybe it's because this machine wasn't originally a machine, and I think what really supports my argument for this is that when we're looking at Orville's face, he himself has a blue dot on it. Later in the episode, we know that there is some sort of disease and sickness that comes with working with these androids and working with this blue blood that will eventually cause the human body to collapse. And if you've worked with this material for a long time, you would probably know this, right? And I would assume that Orville Park would know this. And so maybe the person who has been working with these machines the longest, who is based off of a real-life person who supposedly cut off his head and has it frozen down below in an actual real-life park, was experimenting on how to prolong their life by combining organic material with machines. I'm not saying this is for certain, but all I'm saying, it's a bit weird. The opening scene finishes with Gwen falling off the cliff, wondering if she will ever find knights who can rescue her. We then cut to a montage, and there is a lot to go over because we can assume that Gwen was eventually captured after falling off of the ledge. We can see in these images that she was captured by Olivia again and taken apart and fixed, quote unquote. We then cut to an older Olivia and Gwennavir, supposedly when Olivia is starting to take over Park Planet even more, more. And as Olivia gets older, we get to see how Gwennavir starts getting hated more and more by society. We then cut to a newspaper, which apparently shows an incident in which Gwennavir was brutally mutilated by somebody at the park. But that's not all on this page, because at the very bottom, we get to see that babies are being born blue. And we can assume that this has something to do with Gwennavir and the blue blood that powers her. We then cut to the industrial effects of Park Planet, and specifically the toxins that they are putting out into the atmosphere. If you look at the smoke coming out of the factories, all of it is blue. We're slowly getting introduced to the adverse effects of this blue blood, and we get to see that Olivia throughout her entire life was working on Gwennavir being exposed to this substance. We then cut to a scene where we're introduced to our two main characters, Frankie and Andy, when they were younger. This claw machine is a really brilliant parallel to what happens later in the story, because Frankie during the scene is trying to pick up a Gwennavir to no avail. But later in the episode, we get to see that Frankie does eventually use her crane skills in order to pick up a broken Gwennavir from a trash pile. In the very next scene, where Frankie and Andy are introduced to a Princess Gwennavir, we get to see that they are both within some sort of database, and they are both located within a place called M7. During the interaction that Frankie has with Gwennavir, she ends up fixing one of her fingers, which is something that we're going to have to remember for later on in the episode. We then cut to present day, in which we learn that Andy ends up working for Park Planet as an engineer, and we get to right away see the societal impact that Park Planet has had. We already got to see that their pollution has completely destroyed the environment, but we also get to see that people are not too happy about it. They end up labeling Andy as a crownie, and because of that, people are incredibly rude to her and see her as a traitor. And honestly, can you blame them? Even though Andy is technically just an engineer, the engineers are one of the backbone of this animatronic-led amusement park. The show brings up a pretty interesting conversation on how much responsibility you personally have by working within a system. It is pretty obvious that Andy does not hold any power. She's a cog in the machine, and she is only working for Park Planet in order to make a living. Park Planet is a monopoly. They have taken over every aspect of life, and because of that, there is no escape within the system. If you don't make money, you cannot feed yourself, you cannot clothe yourself, and you cannot have a secure home. These are basic needs that everybody needs to have met, and unfortunately, within this structure, people need to have a job. But then again, what if your job is contributing to the very thing that is destroying your planet? Working for Park Planet is going to give you a level of prestige. When we end up seeing the laboratory, it's beautiful, it's clean, and it looks nothing like the area underneath it. And later in the episode, we're able to see the differences between Andy and Frankie's jobs, and there is a huge difference from just the environment that they're working at to the people who they're working with. Obviously, both of these characters need to make money, and it's very clear that the better job is to be an engineer for Park Planet. But then again, if you're an engineer for Park Planet, how much are you actually contributing to making everybody's lives collectively worse? Again, Andy doesn't have any power, but when you contribute to a system that is destroying the environment, how much blame can you really take? And can you really blame somebody for not wanting to associate with you or not wanting to sell you goods if you are directly contributing to their suffering? It's a hard topic, but also I love the way that Andy responds to this by basically saying that they are trying to divide people. The more that people are divided, the less they are able to work together in order to make their lives better. What Andy is saying here isn't wrong, and that's kind of the beauty of this conversation. It poses two sides of an argument in which neither party is technically wrong, but we also are able to see the faults in each of these characters' arguments. But during their conversation, there is something very interesting that Andy brings up, and that's the fact that the park is ever expanding. Apparently, the park continues to terraform new planets, and this is something that is very interesting, because that would mean that Park Planet, like its name, are actual planets, and every time it ends up going to a new planet, it destroys the environment in order to build an amusement park. This also then would beg the question, who is actually going to these amusement parks, because it seems like the regular average everyday people are unable to, and most of them are completely disgusted with what Park Planet has done to their society. But although many people do seem to have a deep-seated hatred of Gwennavir, that doesn't seem to be the case with our main two characters. In the next scene, we get to see that Frankie is living out her princess fantasies with a bunch of animatronic animals that she created. The snail at the very bottom also has a 420 on it, which is pretty cool. During this scene, Andy is working on an animatronic and trying to get the machine to work again. It's important to note that this machine has a bunch of blue blood coming out of it, which means that we get to see firsthand that Andy is exposed to this blue substance, which obviously won't be good for the future because we've seen the outcomes of people who have been exposed to this substance for long periods of time. During a conversation between Andy and Frankie, it is made very clear that Frankie wants to work with Andy as an engineer for Park Planet. A bit different than what everyone else has been saying about Park Planet. Frankie seems to have this really positive view, while everybody else seems to think that it is this terrible company. Which it is, these people aren't wrong, so why does Frankie have such a different opinion of it? Well, I think it has everything to do with the fact that Frankie is obsessed with Gwennavir. Gwennavir represents the best part of Frankie's life, this wonder, this joy, and because of that, she is completely attached to this character. Gwennavir to Frankie is almost this maternal figure who brings back her childlike wonder, and because of that, Frankie wants to do everything she can to get closer to this feeling. And I hate to put it like this, but Frankie is a Disney adult, and she is constantly trying to chase that feeling that she felt when she was a child. And to her, Gwennavir represents this, so regardless of all of the evil things that Park Planet has been doing, she still wants to work for them because she wants to get closer to this feeling. Andy ends up having to leave for work for the day, and we get to see Frankie standing in front of a poster. And this has two separate meanings. The first meaning is that this society cannot continue to function without workers. If people stopped working, then Park Planet would collapse. The second meaning is that this is something that cannot be done without Gwennavir. The U is in blue, and we get to see a Gwennavir doll right underneath. And later in the episode, we find that this is the case, and without Gwennavir, none of this would actually be happening. We then follow Frankie as she goes to work, making merchandise for Park Planet. During this scene, Frankie ends up fixing one of the machines in order for them to make even more merchandise, but we also get to see that her boss is missing one arm, and her clipboard has blue blood in the corner of it. I do also want to point out here that Frankie throughout the show is shown as a very competent engineer. She's incredibly gifted, and we get to see multiple times how she's able to fix up any mechanical issue with ease. A little bit later, we see she ends up going to help somebody named Sparky, who I would assume is some sort of paternal figure to her. Now, I'm not sure if she's actually related to Sparky in some way, but I think it's pretty clear that they have a much closer connection than just a boss and his worker. But this opening shot is also very important because the entire lake or ocean or whatever body of water this is filled with pollution. We get to see that this blue toxic waste is running out directly into this body of water. And because of that, it's causing the water to have weird and strange colors, almost like there was an oil spill in it. We also get to see that Park Planet just dumps all of its trash into this body of water, which is polluting it even more. Quick side note, this is pretty similar to Gacha Akuda, which, if you don't know, is an anime about trash. Something fun to mention here is that you can see a QR code in this scene, and you can scan it with your phone, and it'll take you to a website with 3 distinct pictures, all looking like they came out of a storybook, and the thing that happens to Gwennavir within this short story basically parallels what happens in the pilot. This then leads into the scene where Frankie finds Gwennavir. And yes, their meeting here is supposed to parallel their very first meeting with the cranes being used in order to pick Gwennavir up. Another thing we have to note about this scene is the symbolism, and it is very heavy-handed, that the symbol of Park Planet, its mascot, what people would associate with it, is completely destroyed and torn apart. This wasn't done by accident. It was supposed to show how corporations will distort their mascots that once originally stood for something pure and fun and childlike, but eventually they get distorted for corporate greed. And I think this is even furthered with the conversation between Frankie and Sparky, in which Sparky is going to sell Gwennavir for parts to the highest bidder. And yes, this scene does have an adult undertone where these parts are not just going to be sold in order to create animatronics, and they may be used for more nefarious things. Which makes a lot of sense because when we're looking back at the design for Gwennavir, everything is supposed to be as feminine as possible. Gwennavir was created to look as feminine and docile as possible, and unfortunately that means that something that was created to be a child icon will eventually get distorted for more adult purposes. After this scene, we end up cutting back to Olivia, who is a lot older, and there is a lot to talk about in this scene. Specifically, I want to first talk about how this entire room still looks like it belongs to a child, which again is done on purpose. In the beginning of the pilot, Olivia does not act like a child, and she's lost that childlike innocence. But now she's acting incredibly childlike, throwing tantrums and being completely obsessed with her toy. Olivia is obviously very sick, but when we're looking at how this medicine is being administered, it's through balloons, and her IV IVs have hearts on them. When we're younger, we're sometimes able to deal with trauma a lot better and push that in, but as we get older and as our mental states start declining, we can sometimes revert back to this childlike state. And because of that, we are unable to control our trauma and we end up acting out and having tantrums, and this is what I'm assuming is happening to Olivia. But that's not the only thing that I want to talk about in this scene, because we actually get a much better view of the family portrait in which we see that Olivia's hair is actually black. And this could mean one of two things. The first thing is that that's not actually Olivia and could be a completely different person. The second thing is that her hair is no longer black because of damage from the blue blood. The other interesting thing about this portrait is the fact that we are clearly able to see Orville's face, but we are unable to see the mother's face. Why is the mom's face completely scratched out? Well, probably because the mom has now been replaced with Gwennavir, and like I said in the very beginning, I would assume that they are supposed to be a one-to-one replacement. At the end of the scene, we get to see that there is a sun guard and a moon guard, with the sun guard having a weird organic right arm. And it almost looks like this arm is mutated because if you're looking at the very bottom, you can see fingernails. The next scene takes place in a lab, and yes, the 6-7 meme is very funny. We do get to see the lab for Park Planet, but we don't get to see much of it as unfortunately Andy is fired from her job. We then get a good look at two different posters which confirm that yes, Park Planet is on multiple different planets and this stuff is crazy unaffordable. There's then a scene where a random civilian comes up to Andy calling her a crownie and spits on her shoe. This is where we're able to see that his saliva is completely blue. And after getting a closer look at him, we can see that his skin is turning blue, which is probably a reference to the very beginning in which we saw that news article talking about blue babies. And I would assume that unfortunately those babies didn't last long because it seems like as you get more and more blue, the health issues become more and more as well. Next up, we get some information about Gwennavir, most notably that Gwennavir is a hive mind. This is obviously going to become very important later in the series because the Gwennavir that Frankie and Andy found will have memories of all of the other Gwennavirs. But after this scene, we get to see that Frankie isn't as mentally sound as we thought, as she's having hallucinations of her animals talking to her. And these hallucinations end up convincing Frankie to go and steal Gwennavir back to fix her up. I also do want to point out that on the chalkboard with all of their chores listed, it looks like Andy makes a lot more dishes than Frankie does. Obviously, we know that Andy and Frankie end up going to steal Gwennavir and are going to try to fix her. As they're trying to steal Gwennavir, we see that something is able to recognize the Gwennavir robot and is stalking both Andy and Frankie. I think we can assume that this is the machine that ends up attacking Andy and Frankie at the end of the episode, but this is pretty interesting that it has this specific function in order to pick out that specific Gwennavir. Because if you remember earlier in the episode, there were some Park Planet police that went by but were unable to pick out the Gwennavir, meaning that this specific function is only on certain robots. But of course, them stealing Gwennavir doesn't go as planned. They obviously end up getting caught by Sparky, who has a very strange tool that looks like it's supposed to pull out teeth. And when we're looking at Frankie, it looks like she's missing 2 teeth, which means that yes, this has probably happened sometime in the past as well. I do also want to point out that it looks like Sparky and his crew refer to Frankie as Frank and Franklin, even though her name is Frankie and Francesca, and we know that this is her legal name because Gwennavir ends up calling her that in the beginning of the series. After a bit of a fight, Andy and Frankie end up convincing Sparky to allow them to fix Gwennavir. During a spit handshake, it looks like Sparky has a bunch of blue blood on his hand. And yes, we could assume that this is coming from Sparky because he is smoking a pipe that is filled with a blue substance. We could also assume because Andy has been working on these androids that it came from her. After this, we end up seeing these two characters go down to the lower labs. This is apparently where all forgotten projects are left to rot, but I think it's pretty interesting that it's a bunch of spheres that it's supposed to mimic Park Planet. Park Planet is on planets, and all of these spheres with forgotten Park Planet projects are also planets of their own. The two characters do end up getting into trouble as we see them get chased by the weird Sun Knight that we saw earlier in the episode. And again, that right arm is definitely organic as we see it moving and twisting and reacting to pain. I also think it's pretty interesting that the Sun Knight seems to have the exact same voice as Orville Park. An explosion ends up taking both Frankie and Andy out, and when they wake up, we get to see that Gwennavir is the one who saved them. And I don't know about you, but these weird tentacles that are holding Frankie are pretty interesting because they could be either one of two things. One of them being the blue blood because we don't know the full capabilities of what this blue blood is able to do, and the other thing would be her intestines. We also get to see when Frankie and Andy are lying next to each other that it looks like Andy had broke her arm or at least dislocated her elbow. Because I don't know know about you, but arms are not supposed to look like that. We then get another hallucination by Frankie in which she is talking directly to Gwennavir. I'm assuming that this is another hallucination, even if some portion of the conversation did happen in real life because these three stuffed animals are the same ones that we saw in a previous hallucination. But one thing is for certain, Gwennavir and Frankie definitely have a strange connection. Gwennavir, of course, ends up saving Frankie and Andy and defeats the knight that's outside. How does she do this? I don't know, but I think it definitely has something to do with those weird tentacles that we saw a little earlier. And at the very end of the episode, we get to see that there are some error codes when they're trying to fix Gwennavir. After looking it up online, the error message X3F will sometimes refer to corruption in metadata, which I guess in Gwennavir's case makes a lot of sense. And at the end of the episode, this Gwennavir ends up remembering both Frankie and Andy. And of course, we're supposed to make the connection that this is the same Gwennavir that both Andy and Frankie met when they were kids. But there's always the possibility that this Gwennavir is just pulling from the data bank that all Gwennavir share. Considering that this Gwennavir was always under the watchful eye of Olivia, it would be pretty interesting to see how the timelines match up and how she was actually able to meet Frankie and Andy. But that's it. That's where the episode ends. They're finally able to reboot this Gwennavir system and we get nothing else. Except in the teaser trailer, we see that the Gwennavir ends up going crazy and I would assume that this is actually something that belongs at the beginning of episode 2. Which I hope happens soon because this episode was absolutely amazing. There is just so much information jam-packed in every single line of this episode and hopefully I was able to explain a little bit and point out certain things that you may have missed. What's going to happen in the rest of the series? I'm still trying to figure that out for myself, but I would love to hear your guys' theories and what you thought about this down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. It really does help out the channel a lot, and I will see you guys next time. Peace, peace.